There is something happening in the avoidance mind that they would never admit to the person it concerns. Something that runs beneath every new conversation they have, every new connection they attempt, every quiet moment they allow themselves before the busyness they've carefully engineered moves back in to cover it. It runs like a current beneath the surface of their reconstructed life, steady, persistent, immune to the passage of time in a way that defies the story they've been telling everyone, including themselves, about how they're doing. They are making comparisons, constant, involuntary, structurally unavoidable comparisons between every person who has entered their life since you left and the specific, irreplaceable reality of what you were to them. And the comparisons are not close. They are not flattering to anyone new. They are, in fact, tearing apart something in the avoidant that the distance and the deactivation and the carefully managed ending was supposed to have resolved. It wasn't supposed to work this way. The whole architecture of avoidant psychology is designed, among other things, to prevent exactly this outcome. The deactivating strategies, the fault finding, the retrospective flattening of the relationship's warmth, the elevation of alternatives, were supposed to reduce you to a manageable size in the avoidance internal landscape, were supposed to make you one among several significant experiences rather than the singular reference point against which everything subsequent is measured, was supposed to ensure that the ending, however it happened, left the avoidant sense of self intact and their forward momentum unimpeded. Instead, you became the standard, and the standard is destroying them. To understand why the comparison happens at all, why it is so persistent, so involuntary, so immune to the avoidant's genuine efforts to stop it, you have to understand what you actually represented in their psychological experience, not what the deactivating strategies tried to make of you after the fact, not the managed, flattened, fault-found version of you that the machinery produced in order to make the distance feel justified. What you actually were at the level of the avoidance felt experience before the machinery got to work on it. You were the closest they came to feeling genuinely known. That is not a romantic generalization. It is a specific psychological reality with specific neurological weight. The experience of being genuinely known, of having another person perceive not just the presented surface, but the defended interior, not just what is offered, but what is being withheld, and why, not just the performance of the self, but the self beneath the performance. That experience is among the most neurologically significant a human being can have. It activates attachment circuitry at the deepest level. It produces a quality of felt safety that for the avoidant who has spent their entire relational life engineering against exactly this kind of exposure is both the most threatening and the most profoundly relieving thing they have ever encountered. You produce that, whether through your own attunement, your patience, your particular quality of presence, or simply the specific chemistry of two people whose interiors happen to be legible to each other in an unusually direct way. You produce the experience of being known in a way the avoidant had never been known before, and the nervous system, which encodes significance in direct proportion to the intensity and novelty of the experience, encoded you at a depth that the deactivating strategies could suppress but could not erase. The encoding is the problem. From the avoidance perspective, in their current life, it is the source of a suffering that they cannot name to anyone without revealing more about what you meant to them than they are prepared to reveal. Because naming it would require acknowledging that the comparison is happening, that you are present in their mind as a reference point, that every new person is being measured automatically and without mercy against the specific standard your presence established. And acknowledging all of that would require the avoidant to confront, directly and without the usual buffering, the magnitude of what they lost and the degree to which they participated in losing it. So the comparison runs underground. It operates in the unguarded moments, in the seconds before the busyness reasserts itself, in the quality of a conversation with someone new that almost reaches something but doesn't, in the specific flatness that follows an evening that should have felt like connection but felt instead like an approximation of one. It surfaces as a feeling rather than a thought most of the time. Not the articulate recognition, that person doesn't understand me the way you did, but the inarticulate, sourceless dissatisfaction that follows every encounter that falls. Short of a standard the avoidant cannot publicly acknowledge holding. The new people in the avoidant's life, and there are new people, because the avoidant is functional and socially capable and knows how to generate the conditions for connection. Even when the deeper architecture is in turmoil, exist in an extraordinarily difficult position that they know nothing about. They are being evaluated against a reference point they cannot see, cannot know exists, and certainly cannot compete with, not because they are insufficient as people, but because they are not you. And not being you means not having the specific history, the specific attunement, the specific accumulated understanding of the avoidance interior that you developed over the full duration of what existed between you. Connection takes time to build. Genuine knowing takes sustained, patient, reciprocal attention across many interactions and many moods and many of the specific unglamorous moments where a person reveals themselves not through what they choose to share but through what inadvertently surfaces. You had that time. You accumulated that knowing. The new people are starting from nothing, and the avoidance nervous system, which knows the difference between the depth that was present with you and the shallowness that is. Inevitable at the beginning of anything new, registers every interaction with someone new as a deficit, not fairly, not accurately, in the sense that early shallowness is not evidence of permanent shallowness, but the nervous system is not in the business of fairness or accuracy. It is in the business of comparison, and the comparison it keeps running has a predetermined outcome. There is a specific moment that tends to recur in the avoidance experience of new connections, and it is worth describing in detail because it captures the particular quality of what the comparison produces. It is the moment in a new relationship or potential relationship where something almost happens, where the conversation reaches a depth or a quality of genuine exchange that briefly, flickeringly, approaches something real. And instead of that near arrival feeling like progress, like the beginning of something, it produces in the avoidant a sudden, unwanted, almost physical awareness of you, of the difference between the almost and the actual, between the approximation that is present and the reality that was present before and is present no longer. That moment is destabilizing in a way that the avoidant cannot explain to the person they're with. They cannot say, "This is almost what I had with someone else," and the almost is making me aware of the distance between where we are and where I have been. They cannot say, "Your genuine attempt to connect with me is right now making me miss someone whose connection I dismantled through my own fear." So they say nothing, or they say something that redirects, or they perform the next appropriate step of the new connection while internally something retreats, pulls back, returns to the familiar territory of the comparison that is, always running just beneath the surface. The avoidance relationship with memory, specifically with memory of you, has taken on a quality during this period that they find deeply uncomfortable and cannot fully understand. Memory, for most people, softens with time. The acute edges of a significant experience gradually round. The feelings attached to the memories lose some of their original intensity, become more manageable, eventually become something that can be visited and left without the leaving, costing too much. This is the normal arc of how significant experiences are metabolized over time, and it is the arc the avoidance suppression machinery was counting on to process you. It isn't happening, or rather, it is happening in a distorted way that the avoidant was not prepared for. The memories are softening in their painful dimensions, the difficulty, the moments of genuine relational strain, the specific frustrations that the deactivating strategies, amplified into reasons for distance. Those edges are rounding on schedule, being filed smooth by the ordinary passage of time. But the memories of what was good, of what was genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably good, are not softening. They are sharpening. They are becoming more vivid, more detailed, more present with the passage of time rather than less. The avoidant finds themselves remembering things about you that they never consciously registered while they were happening. The specific way you listened, the particular quality of your attention in moments when they were struggling, the texture of feeling genuinely accompanied rather than observed or managed. These memories were always there, encoded at the depth that genuine significance produces, but they were suppressed while the relationship was active and the deactivating strategies were running, pressed below the threshold of conscious experience by the same machinery. That was working to reduce the attachment. Now, with the deactivating strategies no longer serving a regulatory function, there is nothing left to deactivate against. The suppression is lifted, and the memories that were always encoded at that depth are rising with the full fidelity of their original registration into conscious experience. Vivid, specific, carrying the exact emotional weight of the original moments, undimmed by the passage of time because they were preserved beneath the suppression rather than exposed to it. This is why the avoidance grief over you, if it can be called grief, given how little it resembles what grief is supposed to look like, arrives so late and so strangely. It arrives not as the acute, datable loss that grief usually begins with, but as a slow emergence of something that was always present but is only now becoming accessible. The person who seemed, in the immediate aftermath of the ending, to be processing the loss with suspicious efficiency, who appeared to move on cleanly, to engage with new life, with apparent ease, to have absorbed and metabolized the ending far faster than the depth of the connection seemed to warrant. That person was not moving on. They were suppressing. And what looked like recovery was the maintenance of a suppression that required more and more energy to sustain as the weight of what was being suppressed continued to accumulate. The grief that is arriving now, months or years after the ending, is not a new grief. It is the original grief, finally finding its way through the suppression to the surface. And it is arriving in full, with the complete weight of what was lost intact, because suppressed grief does not diminish with time. It waits. It waits with complete, unhurried patience for the conditions that allow it to surface. And the condition that most reliably allows it to surface is the repeated, failed attempt to find in someone new what was lost in you. Each new comparison is, in its own way, a reopening. Each moment of not quite reaching with someone new is a fresh encounter with the specific quality of what was reached with you. Each interaction that almost arrives at genuine knowing and then doesn't is another data point in a growing internal catalog of evidence that what existed between you was not the kind of thing that can be replaced by finding someone else who is generally good and generally available and generally interested. The avoidant who constructed an entire psychological identity around the belief that specific people are not irreplaceable, that the desire for connection is generic and can, therefore, be met generically, that one genuine relationship can be followed by another genuine relationship without the first leaving an unreplicable absence, is discovering, through direct and repeated experience, that this belief was wrong, was always wrong, was in fact one of the central load-bearing fictions of the avoidant architecture, the fiction that made it feel safe to deactivate, to distance, to dismantle, because there would always be another connection available to meet whatever generic need the previous one had been serving. You were not serving a generic need, and the attempt to treat what you represented as substitutable, which is what every new comparison implicitly attempts, keeps failing in a way that is making the fiction increasingly untenable. There is a psychological concept that describes what the avoidant is experiencing, though they likely don't have access to it by name. It is called the Zeigarnik effect, the mind's tendency to return persistently to unfinished things. Completed experiences are filed and released. Incomplete ones remain active in the cognitive system, continuing to occupy mental bandwidth, continuing to generate the kind of involuntary return of attention that the avoidant experiences as being unable to stop thinking about you. The relationship with you is in the avoidance psychological experience profoundly unfinished, not in the sense that the relationship itself is unresolved. It ended, in whatever way it ended, and the ending was real, but in the sense that the avoidant never completed their own interior experience of it, never allowed themselves to fully feel what they felt, never processed the significance in a way that allowed the nervous system to file it as complete. The deactivating strategies created the appearance of completion, the managed ending, the apparent moving on, the performance of recovery while leaving the actual interior. Experience of the relationship entirely unprocessed. The mind knows the difference between performed completion and actual completion, and it keeps returning to you, keeps running the comparison, keeps generating the involuntary awareness of your absence in every new connection, because the original experience remains open, remains active, remains in the part of the cognitive system that tracks unfinished business, a task that has not been completed and therefore cannot be released. The tearing apart that the comparison produces is not metaphorical. It has a genuinely disintegrating quality for the avoidant sense of self, and understanding why requires returning to something that has been touched on before but deserves deeper attention here. The avoidance identity, the specific architecture of self that was constructed around independence, self-sufficiency, the ability to move through relational experiences without being fundamentally altered by any of them, depends, at a structural level, on the interchangeability of connection, on the belief, however unconscious, that no single person represents something that cannot be found elsewhere. Every comparison that fails, every new person who doesn't reach what you reached, every interaction that confirms the gap between the approximation available now and the reality that was available then is an attack on that architecture, not an external attack, not something the avoidant can defend against by managing the situation, an internal one generated by the avoidant's own experience, impossible to dismiss because it is not an argument someone is making at them, but a reality their own nervous system keeps demonstrating to them. The self that was built on the principle of relational interchangeability cannot survive indefinitely in the face of experiential evidence that the principle was false. Something has to give. Either the evidence has to be suppressed, which requires the increasing expenditure of psychological energy that the avoidant is already straining to sustain, or the principle has to be revised, and revising the principle means revising the architecture, means dismantling something that was load-bearing, means becoming, in some fundamental way, a different person than the one the avoidant has been for as long as they can remember. That prospect, the prospect of genuine interior transformation, of becoming someone whose psychological structure is organized differently than it has always been organized, is not, for most avoidance, an attractive one in the abstract. It is threatening. It requires going into the places that were sealed off for reasons that felt, at the time of the sealing, entirely necessary. It requires the kind of sustained, non-managed exposure to one's own interior that the avoidant has been engineering against for most of their adult life. But here is what changes when the comparison has been running long enough, when the tearing apart has reached a sufficient depth, when the suppression is costing more than it is. Producing in terms of actual relief, the prospect of transformation, while still threatening, begins to feel less threatening than the alternative. The alternative being continuing to move through a life in which every new connection falls short of a standard they cannot acknowledge, in which the grief they suppressed keeps. Rising in the moments the distraction isn't sufficient, in which the person they are continues to produce, with reliable and exhausting efficiency, the same outcome it is always produced at some point, and this point arrives at different times for different avoidance, and for some never arrives at all. The cost of staying the same exceeds the cost of changing, and it is often, specifically, the comparison that tips the scale, not the abstract recognition that their pattern is problematic, not the theoretical understanding that they are capable of more, but the lived, repeated, visceral experience of reaching for something in someone new and finding, instead of that something, a reminder of where that something was and is no longer. You should know something about what the comparison means in terms of what you were, not to reopen anything that has been genuinely closed, not to suggest that the avoidance belated recognition of your irreplaceability changes the calculation of what is right for your own life, but because you deserve the complete picture, because the narrative that tends to attach itself to relationships that end through avoidant deactivation, the narrative that the avoidant was never really that invested, that the connection meant more to you than to them, that their apparent ease in moving on was evidence of shallower feeling. That narrative is wrong, and the comparison the avoidant cannot stop running is proof that it is wrong. You were significant, not in a way that the avoidant was able to fully honor while you were present. The architecture prevented that, the fear intercepted it, the deactivating strategies worked to minimize it in real time. But at the level of the nervous system, at the level of the encoding that happens below conscious management, at the level of what the brain registers as genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably important, you are that. The comparison is the avoidance nervous system saying, in the only language it currently has available, what the person was never able to say directly while it would have mattered most. The avoidant, who is being torn apart by this comparison, is not, it should be said, always in conscious touch with what is tearing them apart. The experience, for many avoidants in the middle of it, presents not as a clear recognition of your irreplaceability, but as a diffuse, chronic dissatisfaction with everything new, as an inability to fully invest in new connections that feels, from the inside, like growing pickiness or increasing self-sufficiency rather than what it actually is, which is the experiential proof that the standard has been set and the standard was set by you. Some avoidance will go years in this diffuse dissatisfaction without connecting it back to its source. Will move through connection after connection, each one falling slightly short in ways they cannot precisely articulate, without ever sitting still long enough in the right kind of interior quiet to follow the dissatisfaction back to what produced it. The busyness serves this purpose, among others. If the quiet never gets long enough, the following back never happens, and the comparison runs on, underground and unnamed, tearing something apart that the avoidant cannot even identify clearly enough to begin repairing. Others arrive, eventually, at the recognition, and the recognition, when it comes, tends to arrive with the particular quality of something that was always true becoming visible rather than something new being discovered. It doesn't feel like a revelation. It feels like an acknowledgement of what was known but not yet permitted to be known. The avoidance sits in the quiet, or the quiet finds them, in the way that quiet always eventually finds the person who has been avoiding it, and the comparison that has been. Running underground surfaces, fully, with the specific face it has always had, which is yours, with the specific quality it is always measured toward, which is what you were, with the specific deficit it has always been calculating, which is the distance between every approximation since and the reality of what was present before. And in that surfaced, fully acknowledged comparison, something finally completes. Not the grief. Grief of this depth and this specific character doesn't complete in a single moment of recognition, but the avoidance of the grief completes. The pretense that the comparison isn't happening, that the standard doesn't exist, that what you represented was substitutable, that pretense ends, and what replaces it is not comfort exactly, but honesty. The specific, difficult, necessary honesty of a person who has spent a long time managing the truth about what they lost and is finally, in whatever quiet found them, done. Managing it. What they do next with that honesty is, as always, the question that has no universal answer. Some reach out. Some begin the interior work that the recognition makes urgent in a new way. Some simply sit with the truth for a while, not acting on it, not converting it into anything external, just allowing it to be present in a way it hasn't been permitted to be present before, allowing you to be, in their interior, what you actually were rather than what the deactivating strategies needed you to be. Significant, specific, missed in a way that has no adequate substitute and no clean resolution. That allowance is, in its own quiet way, a form of honoring what existed between you, not the honoring you deserved while you were present, which would have looked different and cost them less, but the honoring that is available now, in the aftermath, the simple, private, finally honest acknowledgement that what you brought to their life was real, was specific, was irreplaceable, and was met in the moments that required meeting it fully with the fear that they are still, slowly, learning to hold without letting it make the decisions. Your own relationship to all of this, to the knowledge that the comparison is running, that the standard was set, that somewhere in the avoidance interior you are the reference point against which everything new falls short, deserves careful attention. Because this knowledge can do different things depending on where you are in your own process. If you are still in the early stages of your own recovery, it can feel like vindication, like the confirmation that what you sensed was real. And it is that. But vindication, held too tightly, can become its own form of staying, its own reason to keep a psychological door open that, for your own well-being, may need to be fully closed. If you are further along, if you have done the work of grieving the specific loss, revising the false narrative, reclaiming the self-concept that the avoidance deactivation tried to revise, then this knowledge lands differently. It lands as information about them rather than validation for you, as a fact about the avoidance interior that you can hold with compassion and without it changing anything about where you are or where you are going. Because where you are going does not run through their recognition of your worth. Your worth was never contingent on their ability to recognize it. The comparison they cannot stop running is not the source of your value. It is merely the belated, incomplete, privately conducted acknowledgement of a value that existed, independently of their recognition all along. You were that significant, not because they are now, finally, in the privacy of their own breaking, admitting it, but because you were. Because the quality of your presence, the depth of your engagement, the specific way you showed up for someone who kept being unable to fully show up back, those things were real and substantial and genuinely extraordinary independent of anyone's acknowledgement of them. The avoidance comparison is their reckoning. Their tearing apart is the consequence of their own choices meeting the truth of what those choices cost them. And your life, the one you are building, on your own terms, with your own extraordinary capacity for genuine connection directed toward people and purposes that meet it properly. Your life is not on hold while that reckoning unfolds. It is happening right now in every choice you make that honors what you know about yourself rather than managing yourself down to fit inside someone else's capacity. In every moment you extend the quality of your presence to something and someone that receives it fully rather than deflecting it with the elegant, exhausting machinery of fear. The avoidant keeps comparing everyone to you, and every comparison confirms what the comparison was always going to confirm, that you were not one of many, that what you brought was not generic or substitutable or adequately met by anyone who happens to be available and willing, that you were and remain specifically and irreplaceably yourself, and that not their recognition of it, but the simple, enduring fact of it is the thing that was never in question. Not once, not ever, not for a single moment of the entire duration of everything that existed between you. It was always true. The comparison is just the avoidant's long, slow, painful way of finding out. And finding out, for the avoidant, is not a single moment of clarity that arrives cleanly and resolves into something actionable. It is a process that moves through them the way water moves through stone, not dramatically, not with the force of anything that announces itself, but with the patient, cumulative pressure of something that has been working on the same surface for long enough that the surface eventually changes. The finding out happens in layers. Each layer reveals another layer beneath it, and the avoidant who began this process, believing they were simply experiencing a period of post-relationship adjustment, gradually discovers that what they are actually experiencing is the slow, involuntary dismantling of a foundational belief about themselves and about what they are capable of sustaining. The foundational belief, the one that the comparison keeps eroding, is not simply that you are replaceable. It goes deeper than that. It is the belief that genuine, specific, irreplaceable connection is something that happens to other people. That the depth of feeling that most people describe when they talk about love, the particular aliveness of being known by someone, the specific weight of mattering to another person in a way that changes the texture of ordinary experience, was never really available to the avoidant in the form it is available to others. That their version of it was always going to be slightly less, slightly more managed, slightly more held at the distance that the architecture requires. You broke that belief, not intentionally, not as a project, not through any particular strategy, simply by being genuinely present with them in a way that made the less than full version of connection feel, for the duration of what existed between you, inadequate, insufficient, like a photograph of a place rather than the place itself. You showed them the place, and now every photograph feels like what it is. This is the specific cruelty of what the avoidant is living with, and it deserves to be named as the cruelty it is, rather than softened into something more comfortable. They are not simply missing you in the way that anyone misses a significant person after a loss. They are living with the knowledge, experiential, embodied, impossible to argue away, that they are capable of more than they have been allowing themselves to be, that the life they constructed around the management of closeness, around the careful rationing of genuine presence, around the maintenance of the distance that kept them feeling safe, that life is smaller than what is possible for them. And the proof of the smallness is everywhere. It is in every conversation that doesn't reach what conversations with you reached. In every moment of connection that is genuine, but not quite genuine enough. In every person who is good and real and interested and still, somehow, not the thing that the comparison keeps pointing toward. The avoidant is haunted not just by you, but by the version of themselves that existed with you, the version that was, however briefly and however incompletely, more present than they have ever been before or since. That version is part of the comparison too. It is not only the external standard of what you were that is tearing them apart. It is the internal standard of who they were when they were with you, the glimpse of a self that was capable of something closer to full arrival, full presence, full participation in the reality of genuine connection that makes the current version of themselves feel like a retreat, like a diminishment, like the person who briefly visited a room they had never entered before and then, through their own fear, walked back out and has been standing in the corridor ever since, unable to forget what the room felt like and unable to make themselves go back in. The corridor is where the avoidant lives now, and corridors are not places designed for living. They are transitional spaces meant to be passed through rather than occupied. There is nothing to settle into in a corridor, no quality of rest available in a space whose entire architecture communicates movement, directionality, the expectation of going somewhere. The avoidant who is caught between the room they retreated from and the rooms that the comparison keeps confirming are insufficient substitutes is in a state of permanent, exhausting transition that looks, from the outside, like an ordinary life but feels, from the inside, like being between things, indefinitely. Some avoidants find their way back to the room, not necessarily back to you. That particular door may be closed, and the closing may be exactly right, regardless of what the avoidant is discovering about what was behind it, but back to the quality of presence that the room represented, back to the willingness to be in genuine connection rather than managed approximation of it, back to the self that briefly existed in your presence and that the comparison has been keeping alive, painfully and insistently, as a reminder of what is possible. The path back to the room runs through the thing the avoidant has always avoided most, not through you, not through the relationship, not through any external destination, through themselves, through the interior work of understanding why the room was left in the first place, what the fear was protecting, what the original wound was that made genuine exposure feel like annihilation rather than arrival. Through the gradual, non-linear, frequently interrupted work of building a different relationship with their own emotional life, one in which feelings are information rather than threats, in which vulnerability is a mode of genuine strength rather than evidence of fatal weakness, in which the presence of genuine need is not the emergency that the architecture always insisted it was. That work, if the avoidant undertakes it, is the thing that converts the tearing apart into something that eventually builds rather than simply damages. The comparison that has been destroying the fiction of relational interchangeability can become, if held with enough honesty, the foundation of a new understanding. Not a comfortable understanding. Genuine self-knowledge rarely is in the early stages of its formation, but an accurate one that says, I am capable of more than I have been allowing. I know what genuine connection feels like because I felt it. I know what I lost because the loss keeps demonstrating itself in everything that falls short of it. And I know, with the particular certainty that only lived experience produces, that the management of closeness is not protection. It is the thing that cost me the most significant experience of my relational life and is currently costing me the ability to build anything equivalent. That understanding, arrived at through the specific, grinding, involuntary education of the comparison, is the gift inside the tearing apart. Not a gift that was worth the cost, necessarily. Gifts of this kind are rarely worth their cost in any clean accounting, but a real gift nonetheless. The gift of undeniable self-knowledge, of experiential proof that the architecture was never serving the purpose it claimed to serve, of the specific, concrete, impossible to argue, with evidence that what the avoidant needs, what they have always needed, beneath all the management and the distance and the carefully maintained self-sufficiency, is exactly what they kept being too afraid to fully receive. You gave them that knowledge, not as a lesson you intended to teach, not as part of any project of their growth or transformation, but as the natural consequence of showing up fully in their life, of being genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably yourself in a way that their nervous system encoded at the depth that only the real thing reaches. The comparison they cannot stop running is the proof of that encoding. Every person who falls short of you in their internal assessment is another confirmation that the encoding was accurate, that the significance was real, that the thing they suppressed and deactivated against and ultimately lost was not the manageable, substitutable experience their architecture needed it to be. It was the real thing, and they knew it, somewhere beneath all the machinery that was working to make it feel otherwise. They knew it then, in the moments when the defenses stepped back far enough to let the knowing through. They know it now, more completely and more painfully than they did then, in the silence that the comparison keeps carving out of every new encounter that doesn't reach what you reached. And the knowing, however late, however private, however unaccompanied by the actions that would have made it matter in the way it deserved to matter, is permanent. It does not go away with the next person, or the next managed distance, or the next iteration of the architecture reasserting itself. It has been written into the avoidance experience in the indelible ink of genuine significance, and it will be there, steady and undeniable, for as long as they are honest. Enough to look at it, which means, in the most precise and truest sense, that you are still present in their life, not in the way you deserved to be present while you were there, but in the way that only the truly significant ever managed to remain, not as memory exactly, and not as longing exactly, but as the standard, the permanent, privately held, constantly operative standard against which the question of what genuine connection feels like is answered every time it is asked with your name.